Well, I want to welcome you to our program today, and we have a very special guest with us. His name is Dr. Gary Neal Hansen. He is a professor of the University of Dubuque Theological Seminary. So Gary, thank you so much for being on our program today, and I'll tell you, I'm just so excited about this because Gary is a teacher of church history, and he is well versed with a lot of the theologians, and I just enjoy so much studying about the different theologians, and so to have somebody who's a professor of church history, you know, it's very exciting for me, and so I know I'll be learning a lot, and I'm hoping that all of you will as well. Yeah. So Gary, how long have you been a professor at the University of Dubuque?
I came to the University of Dubuque in 1999.
1999.
So, yes,
okay.
about 15 years now.
Yeah, and so what's some of the things that you like about teaching? What would be some of the things that say, well, this is what I really love about it?
Yeah, well, there are some that are specific to the school itself where I teach, and some to the subject matter. To the school itself, University of Dubuque Theological Seminary is a great place because people come there who love Christ and want to serve the church. Many of them are going to be pastors of churches. Others are going to be chaplains or missionaries or get into Christian publishing or other aspects of work for the Lord. But it's wonderful to start with people who already are on board with a common mission. You know, we're participating together in God's work, and it's a happy thing. But then as far as my subject matter, you know, I teach history of Christianity, and there's more of it every year. It's a growth industry, so that's a great thing. But I get the opportunity to dive into people like the ones we'll be talking about today, whose thought and lives shaped the church, shaped the way that we believe and live the faith today. And so I often tell my students, studying church history is kind of like family therapy on the people of God. You know, you get to explore all the happy stories, and you also explore some of the sad stories, and you get all the stories out on the table, and then you can learn to make wise decisions in the present for your own life, for your own family. But, you know, if we don't know what went on in our heritage, our fathers in the faith and our mothers in the faith, it's really hard to understand who we are today.
Yeah, and so when you think about some of these theologians and how they, you know, have molded and shaped the church and our thinking, and you know, just you know, how rich, you know, a heritage that is. And so today we want to talk about a theologian by the name of Ulrich Zwingli. He was a theologian out of Switzerland. And so, I don't know, he's quite an interesting guy. What was his time? When did he live?
Well, he was born in the late 15th century, 1484, if I remember the date exactly correctly, and which is just within a hair's breadth of when Martin Luther was born. So they're kind of growing up at the same time, different countries, different areas. But if you think about the rise of the Protestant split between Protestantism and the Catholic Church, he's right there at the beginning of it. People would sometimes early on accuse him of being a Lutheran, but he wanted to say, no, we should say Luther is a Zwinglian, right? Because we came up at the same time. Each one of them is influencing the world. They're doing the same kind of thing in rather different ways. And one of the things that shapes the way Zwingli went about his work, I mean, he came up through the university system. He was a highly educated man, but he was not a monk. So he's a different background than Luther. Luther came up through the monastic tradition. Zwingli comes up more through the university system. And one of the things going on in the larger context of Europe in this time is the movement known as the Renaissance, the rebirth of society, looking back to ancient sources. And Zwingli, in his university years, was really formed by that. And he wanted to look at the best of the faith by going back to the best of the sources. So learning the biblical languages and understanding biblical theology in the best way that he could as New Testament literature in the language of Greek, understanding the culture it came from and the way that language and literature work was very important to him. So you get a sort of a different style, at least a sort of different style of change within the church. For Luther, you know, he's someone coming out of monasticism. He has a monastic spirituality that he brings to it. He goes to work as a university professor of Bible, but he's really shaped by the church's monastic life and makes sort of, in many ways, gentle changes to the Catholic faith to create the Lutheran faith in Germany. Zwingli is much more quick to say we need to make radical changes. We need to make big sweeping changes because his understanding was that the Catholic Middle Ages had created a great many problems as Christian teaching and practice had grown like a snowball to add all kinds of things that he didn't find in the Greek New Testament or the Hebrew Old Testament. And they wanted to go back to the basic sources and do really precisely what he believed that God commanded us to do, to teach what God had inspired the apostles and prophets to write.
Isn't that something? Yeah, so to be able to say Luther and Zwingli, I mean, they were living at the same time, but yet really come from different backgrounds when you think about it. But both just, very excellent students and scholars and teachers.
But their churches end up looking quite different, right? Because in the Lutheran church, in Luther's time, you end up still basically having the Mass, but it's a somewhat simplified Mass, removing language that Luther found problematic, or the language of sacrifice in the Mass is left out, but it still looks and feels a lot like the Mass. It's in the German language so people can understand it. Zwingli, on the other hand, says, well, we need to make sweeping changes. We've spent centuries not teaching the people. So what Zwingli does, when he starts his big reforming position, he gets the job at the big church in Zurich, he stands up at the beginning of the new year and he opens up his Greek New Testament to Matthew chapter 1, and instead of going to the lectionary that is provided by the church, he leaves that all completely behind, and he starts at Matthew 1, verse 1, starts reading and explaining and reading and explaining, and he preaches exegetically. He does expositional preaching, trying to help people to understand the Bible. Week by week, day by day, he comes back and preaches all the way through Matthew from cover to cover, instead of the Roman Catholic pattern, which would have a snippet from a lectionary here, a snippet from a lectionary there. So he wants to he's concerned with educating people as Christians so that they know the whole of the biblical message. There's a sort of a Renaissance assumption that if they just know the faith better, they'll start being better Christians.
Yeah, so to be able to really kind of discern between these two great theologians and really what Luther really trying to keep with the Mass, like you say, simplifying it. But then you have Zwingli, where he's coming with a whole new approach, that we don't have the lectionary anymore, but rather he's going to lecture from the Bible, from kind of from Matthew all the way through, and so we kind of see that pattern today. Like I'm in a pastor of a Lutheran church, and so we, even though we're doing kind of like what Zwingli's doing right now, but normally we do have that lectionary. But I do know churches where they're not bound to a lectionary, but rather they will be praying about things and saying, well, right now I'm going to do a series on this, or we're going to go through this book of the Bible. Yeah.
And for Zwingli, it's all about going through the book. He wasn't sort of a topical preacher where he'd say, well, now we're going to do a series on the kingdom parables. It's, you start with Matthew 1 and you finish at the end of Matthew, and then you start on a new book. Because and there was a response one church history that I was reading that found in some text from Zwingli's time, someone who had made a comment in writing that he felt like he was being pulled up by the hairs from his head because of the completely surprising way that he was hearing biblical texts that had been sort of hidden from the church. You'd only hear the Bible as it was read from the pulpit, and now all of a sudden Zwingli was reading the whole of the Bible, not leaving anything out. And that really was the center of worship for him, right? It's for the Lutheran church, you've got the center of worship still being the Eucharist. Now, the Eucharist is important to Zwingli, but it's not the center of every service. It only even happens quarterly. So on a Sunday service, the primary focus is the reading, the preaching, the teaching of the Scriptures, not the reception of the Eucharist.
Yeah, because that would be really, like you say, like at the heart of, preaching of the Word, but then also receiving the Holy Sacrament of the Eucharist. Okay, well, now you mentioned about Zwingli going to Zurich, Switzerland, and before that, though, he was in Glarus, wasn't he?
Yeah, sort of a pilgrim shrine. He was the chaplain to a pilgrim shrine in Glarus.
And, okay, so he went from Glarus to
the Great Munster, the big church.
Grossmünster, the great church in Zurich, which is just this big, beautiful cathedral-like church right along the river there. But you go into this church, and I'm going to ask you this question. You find it to be rather interesting, is you got this beautiful cathedral church, but there's no altar. And there's no like statues or paintings or anything. I mean, it's just almost like it's been stripped down to the bare bones of this building. I mean, it's still very ornate, but no altar.
Right.
Explain that.
Well, it goes to an understanding of what is happening when you do celebrate the Eucharist. For medieval Catholicism, the Eucharist is a representation, a stepping into the reality of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. And so there's lots of language in the Mass, which is language of Christ being sacrificed. Now, to have a sacrifice, you need an altar. That's what you do on an altar. You make sacrifices. You know, look back to your Old Testament passages on whole burnt offerings and all the other kinds of offerings. Altars are places for sacrifice. Well, Zwingli looked at his New Testament and he said, this is not a sacrifice. When Jesus institutes the Eucharist, it's the Last Supper. It's a meal. It's table fellowship. So ever since, in the tradition that Zwingli is at the fountainhead of in the Reformed churches worldwide, there are no altars because there's no sacrifice. There is a table, and the Eucharist is celebrated, as we say, at the Lord's table. And in some times in history and in some places, the Eucharist is actually celebrated by pulling up chairs around the table because you're to remember that it's a meal. You're participating, stepping into the reality of what Christ instituted as table fellowship, the breaking of bread and the pouring of wine, or grape juice, as we more typically do these days.
Yeah, so there's no, I mean, when I was in there was just nothing. Well, right at the back, there was just this little, like, momentum or shrine where it had Zwingli's Bible that he preached from. Which I thought was kind of interesting.
The Bible becomes the one symbol that's still allowed, right?
Yeah, whereas I noticed that there was a picture of the Madonna that was all, you know...
effaced.
Yeah, you could tell that it was there, but it's now gone.
Yeah.
No graven images, and I think a lot of that, in my understanding, is that Zwingli really saw God as spirit, meaning that, like the Holy Spirit, that, I think of like what... as Jesus was doing that whole discussion with the woman at the well, saying that, we don't worship God here on this mountain or down in Jerusalem, but rather God is spirit.
God is spirit.
And I don't know if that is kind of what his takeoff was, that God is spirit, that we, aren't going to try to make any kind of an image that this is what Jesus looks like, or these are statues. But but this whole concept of spirit is that. How does that fit in, or doesn't it, or does it have any bearing on his work and teaching?
The key thing, I suspect if you looked into his discussion of these things, that text would probably be quoted. I don't know for a fact that God is spirit. But the crucial thing that they were terribly concerned with on Zwingli's and Calvin's, the Reformed part of the Reformation, not the Lutheran part, but the Zwingli and Calvinist side of the Reformation, was concerned with what God had actually commanded, right? Because that they were convinced that even after you come to faith, obeying the commands of God in the Ten Commandments and elsewhere is not going to lead you to salvation. You come to salvation by faith in Jesus Christ, but then you have to figure out how you're going to live. And you're changed, your heart is warmed, and you want to love God and please God, so you start looking around for God's will. Well, lo and behold, God has left us these 10 incredibly good ideas, known as the 10 great suggestions. I mean, the 10 great commandments, right? Yeah. So they thought that the most important use of the commandments is for us as people of faith, not to get saved, not to come to salvation or forgiveness, but as an expression of gratitude. So they look very seriously at those 10 commandments, and one of them says, you shall not make a graven image. And that's of a piece with Jesus' words to the woman at the well that God is spirit, but it's clearly a prohibition of some kinds of art that relate to worship, and throughout Europe and into Britain. That's why you find lots of cathedral art and church art damaged, noses broken off, arms broken off throughout Europe, because sometimes people got rowdy about these things, and they said this is idolatry, and so they would go and start busting stuff. But it's a concern that we be people whose lives are formed according to God's instruction. And so they took that in a very thorough going way. Luther would leave devotional art in place for people's piety because it led them toward a deeper faith. Zwingli and Calvin would say, we're not here to be smarter than God. God has said no graven images, so we're just not going to do it.
Yes.
Now there's some things that he made for changes that weren't commanded, but like in another change in the worship life that goes to the faith life. For Zwingli, he, as well as not making the Eucharist a regular weekly practice, he also eliminated church music. He was a very fine musician in his personal life.
Right. They took the organ out of that.
They removed the organ.
Church.
The poor organist was in tears, right? They're busting out the organ.
That's right.
because they needed to strip away anything that he felt that they needed to strip away anything that would be a distraction. So they needed to have a worship space that allowed people to attend to the word being preached so they could know the faith more fully. They really had a strong sense that the pastoral ministry is a teaching ministry. In my tradition, the Presbyterian Church, we've recently gone back to some older language, and we call, instead of calling ourselves pastors, we call ourselves teaching elders, to reemphasize this tradition that we need to be teaching the faith.
Yeah, so I appreciate that. It helps clarify a lot of things for me, that the altar is not there mainly because it's not a sacrifice. A sacrifice is not being made. And then also, well, it's kind of iffy about the whole, John chapter 4, the woman at the well, but then also, the command that no graven images are to be made of me. And so I'd say what you're saying it's more, I would say more the fact of why it is the way that it is. But today in the great church in Zurich, they have this big, beautiful pipe organ. So I don't know if Zwingli is rolling in his grave or not.
I think he's probably over it by now.
Yeah, maybe he is. Yeah.
Have to hope.
Okay, well let's. Okay, so you got. See, from my Lutheran tradition, always, Luther and the Reformation, and then his being excommunicated, and that started, the whole Protestant church and the Lutheran church. But then as I started studying about Zwingli, I just found this is really interesting. Because as Luther was going about the Reformation in Germany, Zwingli was doing the same thing in Switzerland. It's like, it wasn't like, there were other reformers at the time that had the same concerns, and it's not like, it's not like some night that Luther and Zwingli got together and kind of said, let's start a plot. Let's start a plan. This is all independent. So obviously some of the grievances that the church in Germany had and the people of Germany had were the same that were going down in Switzerland. And so, so I find that to be so fascinating.
Well, and it wasn't just Luther and it wasn't just Zwingli either. Switzerland was a confederation of separate cantons, as they called them. And there were lots of them that went the way of Protestantism at much the same time. And Zwingli is just the most famous of those first generation of leaders. There were a number of others, Martin Butzer and Johannes Oecolampadius and any number of others who were actually significant theologians in their own right, but they didn't quite get the amount of press that Zwingli did. Zwingli is a pretty feisty character and got the attention. But it's actually part of a bigger movement, right? There was effort. There was a broad understanding in the late medieval Catholic Church amongst Catholics of all stripes that the Church needed reform. The Church, every human institution needs reform, either occasionally or constantly.
Well, right, constantly.
Because we're always in institutions that are run by broken, fallen people, lives tainted by sin. So we're going to have some unintended consequences, even if we're starting out with our best intent. And there had been many movements for reform in the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, and things were very ripe for reform again. So there were folks that were doing reforming efforts within the Catholic Church, like a guy named Desiderius Erasmus, had a strong reforming agenda, but never became a Protestant. There were people like Ignatius Loyola, who's sort of similar in time frame, a generation later, with Calvin. He starts a brand new Roman Catholic order called the Jesuit order, which has a strong reforming influence, does amazing ministry, and lives are transformed for discipleship and mission, but doesn't become a Protestant. Everybody knew there were problems. The question is, how are we going to address them?
How do we address them? And I know, like for Martin Luther, he had such a love for the church, and that's the last thing he wanted was a split.
Right.
He wanted to reform, but then of course he was excommunicated. But getting back to Martin Luther and Zwingli being reformers, and when I read both of their works, it's almost like they're kind of on the same page. There's concerns, like I say, the reform. But if it's my understanding, they only met once.
So far as I know, I think that's right.
Yeah, so it wasn't like they were meeting for coffee every other month. They were. But they did meet once, and that was at
Marburg.
Marburg, Germany.
In 1529, the leader of the area of Marburg called together a colloquy, a gathering of leaders, because there were these varied bodies, right? There were the Luther people following Luther, there were people following or colleagues with Zwingli, And he was of a mind which I have to say I would share his desire to say, we who are trying to reform the church should all be working together. I mean, it's that we say in the creed that we believe in one church.
Right.
There's something about our unity that is supposed to be part of our witness to the world. So it's a sad thing that we're not working together. So he brings together Luther and Melanchthon from the Lutheran side, and he brings together Zwingli and Butzer and Oecolampadius and maybe some others, I'm not sure, from the Reformed side, and says, can you guys hammer out the differences? You know, can you find a way to make a common declaration of faith? And they almost did, right? They had point after point after point that they agreed on. But then they got down to the Eucharist. And the only point they could not agree on was the Eucharist. But that, when it comes to disagreeing about the Eucharist, it's tip of the iceberg stuff. It's big stuff. I mean, it's the sacrament by which we embody our unity, sharing in this one loaf and joining into this one body of Jesus. So the fact that they couldn't come to unity on the Eucharist meant that they weren't then and still aren't organically united in ministry.
Yeah, so that's the whole thing. Yeah, if I remember right, I think there were 15 points. And they agreed on every one of those points except that 15th, and that had to do with the Eucharist, Holy Communion, and I think it had to do with the real presence of Christ within the elements. And in here again, the way I understand, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and it's almost like shame on us Lutherans, but Zwingli's colleagues just begged Luther and his colleagues to say, well, let's not let this divide us as brothers and sisters in Christ. Let's keep unified. And Martin Luther said, absolutely not.
Well, yeah, there was plenty of fur flying on both sides. I mean, they really were, Zwingli and Luther were quite adamant about the differences. But Luther, he could really be volatile, and this wasn't something that really he saw it as foundational, absolutely crucial, and he wasn't going to let it go. So, I mean, the issue was, I mean, the way I often think of it is, if you look at the documents from the Marburg Colloquy, which are quite a fascinating read, actually, you can actually the dialogue is actually transcribed and written out. Luther tries to make the point that the most important thing in the Eucharist is the words of institution, the thing that Jesus said when he was giving them the first Lord's Supper. And he says, this is my body. Now, he inherited from his strong Catholic background the conviction that that is the crucial thing, and he wanted to say that is a promise, that has to be literally true. If Jesus says, this is my body, it has to be true. And so he says, but Zwingli says, well, you know, Scripture says God is a lot of things, and it's not literally true, right? Because sometimes Scripture says God is a rock, but literally, God's not a rock, right? That's a metaphor. And Zwingli comes from the background of Renaissance study of literature. He looks and sees the patterns of language and says, "This, when Jesus says this is my body, he's using a metaphor, and that's okay. That's the way language works. That's how he's making his point." But Luther says, no, that's where it all matters. That's a promise that Jesus really is present with us. And so Zwingli says, no, what you need to look at is what Jesus commanded us. We get to back to the law again, right? Jesus says in the imperative, as a command, do this in remembrance of me, right? So he may say, in fact, this is my body, but what we need to weigh heavily is it's a command. Do it, and this is how you do it, in remembrance. It's about meditatively recollecting that God in Christ has gone to the cross, has given us this supper, has risen again. We meditate and we remember his death. And that's where Zwingli wants to put the weight. And Zwingli says, and Zwingli and all his colleagues say, well, if you want to know where Jesus' body is, look at the New Testament. It says that in the beginning of Acts that he ascended into heaven. He is at the right, as we say in the Creed, he sits at the right hand of God. So if you want to, they would say, if you want to see his body, he's bodily present at the right hand of God in heaven. So we can do nothing to sort of, as they would say, pull him down. And so they thought it was kind of inappropriate to think that we're going to, by our liturgical action, our action in worship somehow, make him be present. Now, that was a significant point of difference.
Yeah, so what a debate that must have been. Wouldn't you have loved just to be a mouse in the corner during that? Wow. Yeah, so as we look at Zwingli's life then, you know, as far as his teachings and his emphasis, well, one of the things, you know, as you were talking, I kind of picked up on the point. You know, in some ways, what's kind of sad about this, you know, when we read in John chapter 17 about Jesus' priestly prayer that the church will be one, and of course with, you know, like with Luther, then his attempts to reform didn't work out the way that he wanted. There was, the big split in the church then. But then he couldn't quite, this whole point, and I really appreciate the way that you explained that. This whole point of the Eucharist, Holy Communion. But then that ended up dividing the reformers then into two camps. And so you kind of have two branches of the Reformation going on, don't you?
And there are more to follow, right? It's a splintering movement, and has continued to be a splintering movement ever since.
It continues even today, doesn't it? All right, well, as far as Zwingli goes, as far as theology and churches, I find Zwingli interesting. So, and I'm a Lutheran pastor, so he's got some influence on me. But as far as obviously Luther is kind of the big gun theologian for the Lutheran Church, and so Zwingli, where would you say he falls in? What churches really kind of draw from his emphasis and teaching?
Well, there are those that do so explicitly, or at least have that consciousness of the heritage, and those that have been influenced by him without knowing it. The churches that are part of his actual tradition are those that are either have their name Reformed or Presbyterian. The churches from the continent, whether from the Netherlands or from Switzerland or France, if they're part of that family of churches, they call themselves the Reformed Church, based out of this. They call it Reformed theology, the theology of Zwingli and Calvin and others. Over in the British Isles, they call them Presbyterians. Because they had Reformed theology, but their issue was how they structured their government. So those folks have usually some awareness that their theology draws on Zwingli. That's more fully shaped by Calvin a generation later, but they're aware of that. Now, but the thing is that even well beyond the bounds of the formal Reformed tradition, there is a sense in American Christianity, I would say, that some of the points Zwingli makes end up winning the day in people's general perception of what the faith is. So you look at non-denominational Protestantism, or you look at the Baptist churches. There are a lot of the presuppositions, not on baptisms particularly, but on the place of the Word as the center of worship, and the removal of any veneration of religious images in your prayer practice, and the sort of the pushing to the margins the practice of Eucharistic worship, and the idea that it's really about remembrance instead of about real presence.
Well, this is Dr. Gary Hansen. This has been so interesting, so fascinating, and so glad that you came as a guest. And I should just mention that he has written a couple of books: Kneeling with Giants, Learning a Prayer with History's Best Teachers, and also his most recent book is Love Your Bible. And these books can be purchased on Amazon.com. Well, Gary, thank you for being our guest today, and I want to thank you for joining us as well.
Thanks.